It's the week ending Saturday the 8th of June, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen protests taking place during President Trump's UK state visit, the Queen paying tributes to the wartime generation on the 75th anniversary of D-Day, and potential PM Boris Johnson facing court summons over claims he lied during the EU referendum. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team are Holden, Frith, Jamie Timson, and from the Week Junior, we welcome back its editor in awesomeness, Felicity Capon. Before we start this week, there's an important event to commemorate. This is going to be Jamie Timson's final appearance on The Week Unwrapped. The lawyers have finally tracked him down. Anything to say, Jamie?
Yes, me and George
Sorry,
Galloway.
the lawyers have advised me you can't go off script until your story. So everyone keep tuned for a barnstorming finale to this week's podcast. But starting the show this week is Felicity, and what do you think this week should be remembered for?
Welcome to New Zealand, where they're chasing happiness at any cost.
We are delivering low unemployment. We have delivered low debt. We've delivered a plan for addressing mental health challenges. That means every New Zealander will get the help they need when they need it. We've delivered cheaper education for families. We've lifted tens of thousands of children out of poverty, and we are delivering housing to the homeless. That is what a wellbeing budget looks like. That is what we came into politics to do, and we are doing it.
Jacinda Ardern there, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, unveiling her party's budget last Friday. And Felicity, as I say, this is last week's news, but given the time difference with our friends in New Zealand, I'm going to allow it. What is the story?
The story is that she has unveiled her new national budget, and she set out priorities within the budget whereby spending is going to be dictated by what best encourages the well-being of her citizens. So she wants to move away from more traditional bottom-line measures like productivity and economic growth and focus on goals like community, cultural connection and equity and well-being across generations. So
wow.
Part of this...
I mean, that is actually properly radical if it's not just spin, isn't it?
Well, I suppose that's the debate as to whether it is spin and branding and a big PR.
Great, let's have that debate. Holden, is it just spin and branding and big PR?
I think it's probably more on that side because as far as I can see, it's more about how decisions to allocate government spending are taken, and they have to conform to one of a few criteria which will increase health, psychological well-being. I think educational standards is in there too. What it doesn't seem to be, as far as I can see, is a decision to say we're going to reorient the entire economy and abandon GDP growth as a goal. Like you need the GDP growth there in order to fund these spending decisions that you're then going to make on the basis of well-being.
Yeah, I mean, presumably a lot of the seemingly boring things that have nothing to do with well-being are decisions that are still going to be taken in this budget. There will still be a decision about taxes for transfers between banks. It's just that you can spin it, can't you, as that improves the well-being of the country because we make more money for the country.
Yeah, exactly. The detractors are saying that the problem with this is that it's kind of almost setting it up as this is diametrically opposed to GDP, as if they're sort of two mutually exclusive things, and you're sort of setting them up against each other. And of course, that's not really the way it works at all, because GDP is like your piggy bank. This is how you get your money to then implement measures that increase the well-being of your citizens. And well-being is all about welfare. And actually, there are no economies around the world, there are no budgets which aren't about the welfare of its citizens. You know, in the UK, you have the Office of National Statistics, which is always measuring the well-being of its citizens. They always come hand in hand. So it's a slightly, and I think that's why people are sort of saying it is just slick branding, because actually, you know, you need your GDP, you need your money in order to create this welfare.
But Jamie, I mean, I don't know what the job is you're going off to do, but is it writing Jacinda Ardern's prospectus? Because this could have come straight out the Timson manifesto, couldn't it?
Yes, I mean, I think it's obviously a positive from a PR perspective. I think you've got to look, if you look at the nitty-gritty of the budget, which I have done in depth, there is a slowing down of GDP and growth, but not so much that they can flick a switch to start turning on the spending taps. You know, they're actually in quite a kind of they're in quite a sticky position because the economy is clearly slowing down, but not enough that they can actually say, okay, now we need to really like put loads of more money into it. So they're in a bit of a tough situation. Housing, cost of housing in their own budget is meant to go up by another 20%. This is what they expect to. So it is a squeezed middle. It is an economy that actually a lot of people would say is quite familiar to us. But I think what Felicity's point is, and I think is actually really important, is that maybe there's more to an economy than just profitability. And actually, there are some economies in the world. You take Costa Rica, for example, which is only 1/5 of the GDP of the US, but it's got a higher life expectancy. It scores much higher in levels of well-being, and it gets all of its renewable sources, all of its electricity from renewable sources. So there is clearly more than one way to skin a cat, which I guess was the other tagline for the for the budget.
I guess you're in danger of sounding like a kind of privileged Western tourist going to a developing country in a way, aren't you, when you talk about, qualities of happiness? I mean, but that is a thing people will say. They say, oh, I went to Goa and the people there are so happy. They have nothing, but they sit on the beach all day and they have a lovely lifestyle. And of course, that can be kind of true at the same time that the country's finances can be in massive disarray.
And measuring these two and working out what the payoff between them is a real challenge for economists. And in fact, even measuring GDP as a representative of wealth has come in for a lot of criticism. And some economists think that it's, because it dates from a time when economies were based on agriculture and industry, it doesn't really capture digital and intellectual economy nearly as effectively. But by the time you get down to trying to measure well-being and happiness, that becomes very, very complicated and subjective, particularly when you're comparing different countries and cultures.
I think that's the problem. It's so subjective. Your happiness is dependent on so many things, and it varies from day to day. And also, I think the other problem is that it would take. How is this going to be measured in the future? Because governments are in power for such a relatively short period of time. It's going to take decades to see whether these measures have, been in any way successful. So the whole thing does seem like a bit lofty and a bit wishy-washy in some way.
But there's a fundamental fact that if people's mental health is in decline or there are stresses on mental health, their productivity will be lower. The economy will be under strain if people's mental health...
That's not the case in China, is it?
China's government probably doesn't give a toss about its people, right? Or its happiness.
And they're the world's manufacturing base.
Exactly. But they have probably done more to lift people out of poverty and improve the living standards of its people. So I think China is probably an example of where actually caring about the happiness of your citizens and actually alleviating poverty.
I don't think that New Zealand is looking to China for its way to kind of manage an economy, or I think that's a false comparison.
But I think the test of this will be whether the focus on well-being, even as a spending criteria, can be maintained at a time when budgets have to be cut. Say the economy doesn't perform as well as it's expected. Because actually David Cameron promised something very similar in opposition.
The happiness index.
Yes, and he said it's time we admitted there's more to life than money, and it's time we focus not just on GDP, but on GWB, general well-being.
Oh, did this shed cost?
well, he's certainly focusing on his own general well-being. But that promise came before the financial crisis. And then I think, although he still kept talking about the well-being agenda, a lot of that was drowned out by the focus on the deficit. And once you're introducing an austerity program, it's then very difficult to present that as something that's designed around the well-being of the population.
As if every decision has been taken bearing in mind people's happiness, when clearly you've made compromises there.
I think the other country that should be mentioned in this discussion is Bhutan, because their Prime Minister introduced...
What I love about this podcast, didn't see that come in.
Gross national happiness. They introduced this to the United Nations Forum as a paradigm for alternative development in 1998, and they were kind of the first country to do it in a big way, and everyone always thinks Bhutan as being like super, super happy, and they kind of made a thing of like exporting it as happiness, and I feel they're the ones who have sort of spawned happiness as this global export. But actually, when you dig down, they're not as super happy as they'd like you to believe. Youth employment stood at 13.2% in 2016. That was up from 10.7% the previous year. In the World Happiness Index, it's really, really low. I can't remember quite how low, but it's still one of the least developed countries according to the UN.
It's also been accused of using some of its standards of happiness to actually pursue an agenda of persecuting minorities, because one of the criteria is traditional cultural expression, and that is interpreted within the standards as being Buddhist cultural expression. So its Hindu minorities have been restricted from their own traditions, and in fact, quite a large number have been expelled into Nepal.
But this isn't about Bhutan, this is about New Zealand. In terms of this decision by the New Zealand government, isn't it really about presenting the way they philosophically are constituted to the world? It's not really about domestic policy.
It's about a worldview.
Yeah.
It's about a worldview that they want to present. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad idea. It
doesn't mean anything. It's just virtue signalling. Like, what are you actually going to do?
I think what's interesting about this...
Make Trump look more evil?
About this budget is that it does take on board the ideas about climate change. I don't think we can talk about perpetual economic growth without looking at the fact about climate change. You know, the reason that we're able to continually have a rise in GDP is because of the way in the industrial area we have just taken from the land. And Philip Hammond this week sent an email to Theresa May saying that if she wanted to cut the carbon footprint by 2050, it would cost trillions and trillions of pounds. And he was saying, are you sure this is what you would like to do? And I think that's the thing, is that we have to start looking at it from a budgetary perspective if we are going to make any difference to this world. Why did he ask her?
Anyway, if you want to find out more about this particular story, you can read a detailed briefing, I understand. Where, Jamie?
theweek.co.uk/unwrapped.
There
Company
we go.
man till I die.
Okay, Holden's up next after this. Okay, we are one story away from the Jamie apocalypse. Holden, it's your story now. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Now, at last, we can enjoy the fruit of our robots' labours.
Oh my god, guys, that was horrible.
We called it quits after about 7 hours. We filled 2 bins between the two of us, which is good for like 700 kilos of pears.
We get $42 per bin, so we worked 7 hours and we
only earn $80 or something.
But apparently these pears are very difficult.
Yeah, someone with more experience than us just said that he was struggling as well. If he was doing apples, he said he would have done like 5 bins in the same time it took him to do 1.5 now. So
yeah.
That was the YouTubers Boy and Girl Meet World trying their hand at picking fruit in Australia last year. Holden, what's the story this week?
The story this week, which may or may not please the people we've just heard from, is that a company called Fieldwork Robotics has started trials of a robot which is capable of picking 25,000 raspberries per day.
I'm sorry, it's just the word raspberries is funny in a serious news context. Carry on.
Well, raspberries are a serious business for robots. They've always been seen as a bit of a challenge for robot fruit pickers because... Well, the robot has to be able to tell how ripe each individual raspberry is, and by the time they're ripe enough to pick, they're also very fragile. So the robot has to calibrate the force so that it's just strong enough to be able to pluck it from the bush, but not so strong that it turns it into a pulp.
Okay, so why not use people then?
Well, the new robot will pick raspberries much more quickly than professional pickers. Apparently, professional fruit pickers can manage 15,000 raspberries per day,
wow,
which is impressive in itself, but say that's 10,000 less than this new robot will be capable of.
And therefore, is this a shift that you think will solve Britain's fruit picking crisis as we head into Brexit?
I think it probably does herald a shift away from that kind of very basic manual labour, particularly if there is going to be less of a supply of migrant labour from the EU. But I think more broadly than that, it shows the way in which robots are moving into these areas that have previously been the preserve of humans, not because they were particularly mentally challenging, but just because there were odd little skills that for one reason or another humans were much more effective than any kind of automated system.
And Felicity, you can sort of understand why people working in AI and robotics want to work on this sort of technology. There's clearly a market for it in agriculture, and it's an amazing technological achievement to get a machine that can pick a raspberry without squishing it. But it's also kind of depressing, isn't it? It's another one of these stories where people are going to lose their jobs, unskilled people who are going to struggle to find other jobs. Yeah,
I think it's for low-skilled workers, it's not good, but it's one of those technologies where AI will need high-skilled workers. So it's going to as with all AI, it's going to sort of shift the skill sets that humans are going to need. But I'm not overly worried about it, because I was reading that I think it's the idea of robots about whether they can have like the human touch, isn't it? And about whether they're becoming more sensitive, that, you know, being able to pick things up which are very delicate, that they can actually start to do that now, which is kind of exciting and scary. But there's also lots of instances where actually manufacturers and companies that have been rolling out AI are now starting to roll back the other way. So Elon Musk famously said humans are underrated, and on Tesla he admitted that they'd miscalculated by turning towards heavy automation on one of its assembly lines, and after production issues had increased, the electric car maker reversed its course and started giving tasks back to people. And you're seeing that at Mercedes-Benz as well, where they've actually started giving jobs back to people, which makes me think that we're still a long way off AI being able to replicate, you know, the human touch and that sort of thing. And there's also some like hilarious, I mean, there's a really funny examples of how AI and technology is still messing up things. So take translators, for example, like Google Translate is really good for translating a simple fragment to send on a postcard. But there's an internet sensation, which I only just heard about, by someone called Melinda Kathleen Rees, who puts song lyrics through several languages on Google Translate and then back into English and records them with really funny results. So the Disney hit Let It Go becomes Give Up. And in Adele's song Hello, the line "Hello from the other side" turns into "Welcome to the party," which really cracked me up.
Okay, but that is an example of where our brains are perhaps more developed than
True.
their computers. But this is a physical task, and if a computer can be programmed to do it, then it will. And that's the mathematical basis on which it will be worked out. Is it time for robot tax, Jamie?
Ooh, interesting. I like this story because I think it allows me to go back through the hits of some of the previous topics I brought to the table. So if there are low-skilled workers losing their jobs, perhaps it might be a good idea to maybe look at fully automated luxury communism as an idea.
Remind us what that means.
Well, fully automated luxury communism is a way of looking at the future, which will see that robots will do all of the low-skilled work, allowing much more free time for creativity for people. You know, things like the 4-day week, which I think was another one of the topics I brought to the table. These are all possible with the robots
Sounds like a dictator stepping down, doesn't it?
These are
the military are outside.
These are all the things.
But he's making it sound like his decision.
please.
Just
keep
unpacking
listening.
the Jamie bot.
Yeah. And I think that the fears are clear. I'd like to see what the robots think when they do achieve sentience, about you laughing at their inability to translate songs. I think you'll be first against the wall.
I mean, in terms of robots that can feel things, there's been another development this week on that as well, hasn't there, Holden?
Yes, and this is actually a device which will help to develop a lot more robots in a similar vein in the future. So it was a group at MIT who have announced in the journal Nature that they've created a glove that can measure and record exactly how humans interact with objects when they're picking them up. Because it's a really complicated process that we're completely unaware of because it just comes instinctively. But as soon as you start to touch an object, you're sensing its weight, how heavy it is, if it's slippery, if it's fragile, and you're adjusting your grip all the time according to those factors. And so this glove will sense exactly how we're doing that all of the time, and then give robotics engineers a lot more data to work with, so that robots of the future will be able to replicate that and have much more of a human feeling touch.
I have that thing that I think is really exciting about this is the possibility for social care. And social care is probably one of the toughest jobs around, and it's probably the one that will end up being automated as quickly as possible. And things like this is really important because the way that you touch someone when you're caring for them, if it's a robot at the moment doing it, you can tell that that's probably like 80% of people's fear is that a robot will grab them in a way that is not nice.
That is not their fear. The fear is that they're no longer... I mean, that's awful. That's not a good thing to have robots taking over our social care. They want humans. I think their deepest fear is that you're going to be stuck, left on your own with a bunch of bloody robots touching you up. No one wants that.
Well, both things can be true, of course. I mean, someone will want the human connection.
But I don't see why you think that's a positive thing.
No, but because, I suppose, well, how am I defending Jamie Timson in his final appearance? I suppose because people People will want the human connection, you're right, of course, in their primary care, but maybe a simple task like being helped to the toilet, it might actually be more dignified to do that with a robot than with another person, where you've got to take your clothes off.
It's still in its infancy, this technology, so it might not be more dignified. If the robot really messes up, then it could be way more undignified.
Of course it's still in its infancy, but in the future you'd hope that this technology would advance to a point where, yes, while I agree that I would still want a human and not a robot to do it, there will become a time where humans no longer want to do that job. Why is social care... Yeah, no, it's not a good thing, but what do we do then? We just let old people die?
To pick a less controversial example, I suppose something like massage. That's something that people, if you have to pay for a massage therapist to come to your house or you have to go to a spa to have a massage, that's something that if your computer could do for you, would be cheaper, and actually if you could trust that it wasn't going to crush your bones, would be quite a useful feature, wouldn't it? That's not about human touch, is it?
No, I think that would be a very popular machine if you could.
You get them at airports, don't you?
Yeah,
massage
and
chairs.
I suppose that and the more realistic they became, the more popular they would become.
And creepy.
But and creepy, and there is that idea of uncanny valley that the closer you get to humanity in a robot, the more uncomfortable we become with it, because we still spot those differences. But I think the broader point is that a lot of the jobs that are at risk of being lost to robots are in themselves quite dehumanizing and robotic. It's just that we haven't had robots good enough to do them. So I think in those, the idea of insisting that people have to carry out these mindless tasks just because of an ideological objection to robots is probably not sustainable.
It's not just that. I mean, there's kind of, you could see a philosophical vein in terms of, raspberries come out of the earth. It is natural for people to encounter them and pick them. Bringing a robot into that scenario, yes, it's farming, yes, it's agriculture, but actually bringing a robot into that scenario is the thing that for some people makes that creepy. That humans picking it is what we've been doing since humans were invented.
And agriculture is actually a huge area of growth for robots at the moment. There's quite a few other trials underway at the moment. One in Hampshire involving small robots that kill weeds with lasers, which also sounds like the beginning of a dystopia. But, we all probably have a fairly incorrect view of what farming is anyway. We think of a much more fairy tale idea of a farmer sort of leaning on his gate, when in fact it's a huge business, and you have 24-hour harvesting using enormous machines. But these little robots actually could have huge environmental benefits, because if you can go around kind of individually blasting weeds, it means you don't have to use pesticides to the same extent. These little robots are much lighter than tractors, so they don't damage soil in the same way. That means rain soaks in more easily.
Also, mental health problems in farming and suicide rates in this country are really terrible.
So watch out for more weed-killing robots in New Zealand.
And death by lasers amongst farmers.
Yes.
Jamie, your big show-stopping number, your big finish, is coming up after this. And so, wipe away your tears. Finally this week, and forever, it's Jamie. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
I'm not dying.
In a sense, you are.
This was the week we realised the day after tomorrow could come sooner than we think.
We will change forever.
I vote for it.
Don't you dare.
It's a terrible, terrible world. But I want to see every second of it.
This country has never been more magnificent. I look ahead and see glory. Are you with me?
You don't mind, do you?
No.
A trailer for Years and Years, currently showing on BBC One and coming soon to HBO, starring Emma Thompson. Jamie, what's the story?
Yeah, Years and Years is onto its fourth episode, but Black Mirror is also returning. Mm-hmm. And there was a very interesting article in the BBC. I think it probably actually was written to coincide with Years and Years, but it looked at the reason that we have now decided that the near future, or even the near future, culturally is much more terrifying than the future, the faraway future. Certainly when you look at the most popular television series at the moment, things like Westworld, Humans, obviously Black Mirror, as we were saying, some of the more, films like Children of Men and Her as well, there's been a big shift culturally to say that actually it's the things that we recognise slightly turning, maybe set 10 years in the future, 5 years in the future. Though that's the thing that will really freak people out. And so, I mean, the question of why, I think, is really interesting. And partially it's down to technology. Partially, I think that in the old days, the future could be, something completely out there. We don't really know. But now we've had so much technological change since the year 2000 that we find anything that isn't related to the things that we are in contact with all the time slightly too fanciful, not something we're interested in. And I think also there's probably an element of kind of the problem with what people are telling us about the future, actually about this podcast in general, asking what will we look back on in the next 10 years. I think the problem with doing that is that things could change rapidly, hugely, absolutely. And so from all of our culture that we need to kind of engage with, it needs to be something that's closer to us for it to be successful.
So 10 years ago, the majority of people were yet to have a smartphone.
Yeah.
But has it really changed fundamentally, Holden, from what sci-fi used to do? I mean, in the 60s, when man was on the moon, you got Star Trek, because that did actually seem like a plausible thing, that 50 years hence, people would be in spaceships flying around the world. They're not. But, I mean, it's the same thing with Years and Years, isn't it? I don't want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it, particularly in the USA, if it hasn't been on yet. But the drama moves at 5-year intervals, and you see a lot of technology that you vaguely recognise from now accelerating in horrible ways. It's just that we can see the thread, isn't it?
That is partly true, but there does seem to be more of a focus now on what is similar, and using that as a foil to show how the dystopia emerges from the difference. Whereas I think that some of the older sci-fis, it tended to be about trying to make something as different as possible, as shiny, as futuristic. And so there was much more of a focus on looking further into the future and trying to kind of imagine the most fantastical idea. Whereas now, I think what makes The Handmaid's Tale particularly powerful was the flashback scenes you saw to the immediate build-up to the coup or the revolution or whatever that is. And it's a very recognizable world. 95% of it is exactly what you could see walking down the street now, but there's just those sort of little 5% of differences, and it gives you, it's almost that uncanny valley that we were talking about. It's the familiarity just spiked with something that feels not quite right, and how that then turns into something more horrible.
I think The Handmaid's Tale was particularly interesting because there was a really good, when the first series came out, there was a really good piece in the Times, and I can't remember who wrote it, but she had been watching it with her partner, and he was sort of saying, yeah, it's great TV, but like this would just never happen. It's just so ridiculous. And she was like, what? Are you kidding me? Like, Margaret Atwood based this pretty much on the Iranian Revolution, where overnight you had women who had all these freedoms who suddenly, and then this journalist sort of went to all these examples around the world, including Mike Pence in the US saying that women who had abortions should be made to go to the funerals of their fetuses, and all this stuff, which is just straight out of The Handmaid's Tale. And yeah, I think that's really, really powerful. And I agree that the flashbacks were powerful because you could imagine it did seem far-fetched, but equally it didn't seem so far off in the future. And there were already so many instances and examples of it happening around the world. And I just thought that was interesting that someone would say, oh, this would never happen. And then a lot of women who are like, this 100% is going on right now.
It's also, I suppose, Jamie, a way of people crystallising why they feel uncomfortable about contemporary technology. It can sometimes be hard, especially when it happens in such slow gradients, an upgrade to your phone. Yeah. A thing that everyone's using, a new feature on Facebook. It can be hard to explain why that unsettles you, but when you see that it leads to, in a dystopian near future, someone dying or someone being followed by the police, then you can kind of say, well, that's what could happen.
Yeah, I think it's exactly that. I think it's also that duality that you have on so many different topics, and actually I think that even the topics that we bring up on this podcast every week, and it's that thing of like, oh yeah, so we have got this kind of gene editing technology, which means that possibly all disease is going to be eradicated, but then also the NHS, that's got huge waiting lists, and there's lots of big queues and stuff, and people are constantly confronted by this, like, technology is going to change and save your life, and yet also the current situation that we live in, the current world is seemingly going backwards a bit. And so I think that's something that they've managed to really tap into really well, is this concept, is a duality between everything is going to be amazing, but also things aren't really that good now.
Yeah,
things are terrifying now, and I think that's why it's all about the immediate future, because like climate change and Brexit and all this, we might not be here in the distant future. So actually we've got to focus on the next 5 years. And I feel like all this sci-fi is tapping into the fact that the world is just getting really, really scary.
But
right
I think
now.
it probably always has been. And I think that, the fact, I hadn't realised that The Handmaid's Tale sort of sprung out of the Iranian Revolution, but a lot of the commentary on the TV series when that arrived was about how it feels particularly terrifying right at this moment. But it feels as if you could drop that into almost any period over the last several decades, and there would be something that it chimed with. There would be some kind of parallel.
There are obvious parallels with the Cold War and the culture that was in that.
And I think a lot of sci-fi did have the Cold War looming over it, and the threat of the atom bomb, and the appeasement of dictators is another kind of recurrent theme. And I remember being in a history lesson at school in the mid '90s, which is sort of now looked back on almost as a kind of halcyon period of peace. And the teacher was talking in a really impassioned way about the conflict in the Balkans and how the patterns that led to the First World War were repeating, and how the conflict could ignite and spread at any moment. And I think sci-fi is often working with those fears, and the kind of other tropes we have also talked about on the podcast of pandemic, disease emerging from somewhere. And these are all ideas that can start with something very small and almost unnoticed, and then gradually they build and build. And so it lends itself to TV drama very well and sort of explores our fears.
But we're enjoying watching it, aren't we? And that duality that Jamie was talking about is the irony you see writ large every time someone takes to social media to be excited there's a new episode of Black Mirror on Netflix. I mean, it's all, our experience of watching it is all predicated on the technology that it is warning us about.
And I think that, like, the success of Years and Years, I think it's an amazing program. Apart from, like, the acting is very good and all of that stuff, is that idea of, I think people do want, one of the few good things, I think there's not that many of the past 5 years, is that people do engage with politics now. I mean, it's impossible not to, but you look at how people have taken on voting in things and talking about it and having all of that. People do engage with it, and I think Years and Years taps into that. And obviously things are really, really terrible now in lots of ways, but it is something that we can get out of culture as well.
But will these programmes just look like a flash of this period of time in the near future? I mean, in 10 years' time, will shows like Black Mirror seem ridiculous because the technology they're predicting either did come true or was way off the mark?
The example that springs to my mind is Minority Report, because they predicted so much and they got so much of it right. And I'm just struggling to think if there was something in it that was just completely ridiculous that they got wrong. But they were really accurate, weren't they? And so I wonder, I imagine, because I think, as someone, maybe Jamie mentioned earlier, because science and advances in science and technology is moving so quickly and sci-fi is having to keep up, I imagine the predictions are going to be pretty accurate.
The best of them, I think, it doesn't matter whether they're accurate in a literal way, like thinking of 1984, which clearly didn't pan out exactly as George Orwell suggested, but there was enough of the spirit of what he was talking about that's become the sort of go-to dystopian novel for this.
But also there is value in getting it wrong. And so even imagining alternatives in history, which culture does very well, thinking about like Fatherland by Robert Harris, where he imagines what would happen if the Nazis had invaded. And that's so important. And I think culture has a really important role to play in that. In, history, it could have gone in so many different directions, so many things might have changed, so many variables, and culture is the thing that gets to explore all those. So even if it doesn't come true, it's still necessarily important that we see what the alternative realities could have been.
It's also sometimes interesting to look back a little bit and see the little ways in which they've gone wrong. I watched a really good Norwegian series called Occupied, which is about a stealth Russian invasion of Norway, and it was made in 2015, so before anyone had thought Trump would become president. And in order to...
Apart from Donald Trump.
I'm not sure even he had convinced himself at that point. But in order to get the plot to work, they had to insert this really clunky piece of dialogue where somebody says, "Oh, and of course we all remember that the US withdrew from NATO," and then I watched it at the beginning of 2017, just after the inauguration of Trump. So the idea of a US president withdrawing from NATO and allowing Russia to infiltrate Northern Europe seemed far less fanciful at that point.
Well, it's horrifying to imagine an alternative reality where Jamie Timson will no longer be on The Week Unwrapped, but I'm afraid, listeners, that is the reality we are about to encounter. Jamie, that was it. That was your last ever story.
Thank you.
How's it been?
Final words. I think everyone, it's been a privilege for them to have spent some time on the podcast with me.
Thank you, Jamie. Your contributions have been memorable. And what are you off to do next? Can you say?
I'm going, actually, yes, I can. I'm actually going to the civil service to work for the government, because long-term listeners will know that I've never been more supportive than of this government.
That's right. What an absolute... I'm talking about shocking future visions. Jamie Timson being a civil servant. There you go. Tells you everything you need to know. Well, best of luck with that.
Thank you very much.
That's it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Felicity Capon, Holden, Frith and Jamie Timson. And, of course, you can help others discover the show by reviewing us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And, in fact, I'd like to finish this week's show by reading the following contribution from JSR 1980, whose review reads as follows. A great podcast if you can tolerate Jamie Timson. Other commentators are thoughtful and balanced, but Timson's undeserved confidence in his own opinions and experiences is consistently jarring, obnoxious and reactionary new laddism at its worst. 5 stars. So do come back, JSR 1980, and Jamie, thank you for stirring the pot. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby. The producers Emma Corsham and Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week. Bye-bye.